September 1945. Tokyo lay in ruins. But the real shock wasn't the destroyed buildings or the hunger that gnawed at every belly. It was what rolled into the city on that bright autumn morning. The women of Japan had been told for years that Americans were demons with horns, savage beasts who would devour their children and defile their honor. They clutched their few belongings and hid their faces, trembling as the convoy of military trucks rumbled down what remained of the streets. Then the truck stopped and the tailgates dropped, and what stepped out changed everything they thought they knew about their conquerors. Haruko Tanaka stood frozen outside the makeshift clinic, her nurse's uniform hanging loose on her malnourished frame. She was 24 but looked 40. The war had taken her husband at Okinawa and stolen the light from her eyes. For months she had steeled herself for this moment, repeating the words from the final radio broadcasts before surrender. The Americans are coming. They are not human. They will destroy everything. She expected monsters. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. The first soldier who jumped down from the truck was tall, impossibly tall, at least 6 feet if not more. His uniform was clean, pressed, fitted to a body that showed no signs of starvation. His shoulders were broad, his posture relaxed and confident. He wore sunglasses, aviator style, reflecting the morning sun. When he removed them, his eyes were bright, alert, healthy. He was chewing something, moving his jaw in a casual rhythm that seemed almost obscene in its normalcy. Chewing gum. She had not seen anyone chew gum in 3 years. Behind him, more soldiers emerged, all tall, all healthy, all impossibly vital compared to the hollow-eyed men who shuffled through Tokyo's ruins. Their teeth were white and straight when they smiled. Their skin had color, not the gray pallor of chronic hunger. They moved with energy, with life, with a physical presence that seemed to fill the entire street. Haruko's hand went to her mouth. These were not demons. These were men who looked like they had stepped out of the American films that had been banned since 1941. Movie stars. That was the only comparison her mind could make. They looked like movie stars. Beside her, 16-year-old Emiko Yamamoto let out a small sound. Half gasp, half something else. The girl had lost her parents in the firebombing of Tokyo and lived now with her grandmother in a shelter made from scavenged wood and corrugated metal. Emiko had never seen an American before. The propaganda posters had shown them as literal demons, red-skinned with horns and fangs dripping blood. The reality standing 30 feet away was so different, it broke something in her understanding of the world. One of the soldiers noticed them watching. He was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair and features that seemed somehow familiar. He walked toward them with easy strides, and when he spoke, the words were in perfect Japanese. "My name is Corporal Daniel Suzuki. I'm here to help coordinate relief supplies. Please don't be afraid." His Japanese was flawless, with a slight accent that placed him as Nisei, second generation. Haruko found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "You speak our language." "My parents were from Hiroshima. I was born in California." The weight of that statement hung in the air. Hiroshima, the city that had been erased by a single bomb just 1 month earlier. This man's ancestral home, destroyed by his own country's weapon, and yet here he stood in an American uniform, offering help. Emiko stepped forward, her natural curiosity overcoming her grandmother's warnings to stay back and stay silent. "You're so tall. Are all Americans this tall?" Corporal Suzuki smiled, and it was a kind smile, not mocking. "Many of us, yes. It's mostly about nutrition. We've had access to meat, milk, vegetables, enough food. Food." The word seemed to echo. Haruko had not had enough food since 1943. None of them had. The average Japanese civilian had been surviving on less than 1,500 calories a day for 2 years. Children were stunted. Adults were skeletal. And these Americans, these supposed demons, they glowed with health that came from having enough to eat. More trucks were arriving now, and Japanese civilians were emerging from their shelters, drawn by curiosity and the desperate hope that these trucks might contain food. Haruko saw her brother Hiroshi among them, and her heart clenched. Hiroshi had returned from the war 3 weeks ago, one of the lucky ones who survived. But he was not the man who had left. He was 32 and weighed perhaps 110 pounds. His uniform hung on him like a shroud. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. When he stood next to the American soldiers, the contrast was brutal and humiliating. Hiroshi had been a soldier of the emperor, He had believed in Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, the superiority of Japanese discipline and will over American decadence and materialism. He had been told that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans, that Japanese spirit would overcome American machinery. Now he stood next to Sergeant James Morrison, a corn-fed boy from Iowa who stood 6'2" and weighed 190 pounds of solid muscle, and the mathematics of the propaganda fell apart. This was not about spirit or will. This was about a nation that could feed its people against one that could not. This was about industrial capacity and resources and all the material things that Japanese commanders had dismissed as unimportant compared to fighting spirit. Morrison was handing out chocolate bars to children. Real chocolate, Hershey's bars, something most of these kids had never tasted. He was doing it with a genuine smile, crouching down to their level, making eye contact, treating them like human beings, and not like the children of a defeated enemy. One little boy, maybe 5 years old, took the chocolate with trembling hands and immediately burst into tears. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming kindness of the gesture. Haruko watched this and felt something crack inside her chest. For 4 years she had been told to hate Americans, to fear them, to see them as less than human. And in less than 10 minutes, that entire edifice of propaganda was crumbling. These men were not monsters. They were not demons. They were just men, impossibly healthy men from a country that had so much abundance it could send chocolate to the children of its enemies. Lieutenant Anderson, the officer in charge, was conferring with Corporal Suzuki and a Japanese official who had emerged from the municipal building. Anderson was 35, older than most of the soldiers, with gray already showing at his temples. He carried himself with authority, but without arrogance. When he spoke through Suzuki's translation, his words were about setting up food distribution points, medical care, sanitation to prevent disease, practical things, helpful things, not the rape and pillage that the final desperate broadcasts had promised would come with the American occupation. Emiko had edged closer to the trucks, fascinated. She had never seen vehicles so clean, so well maintained. Everything in Japan was broken down, patched together, running on fumes. These trucks looked like they had just rolled off an assembly line. The tires were new. The paint was intact. Everything worked. It was a level of material wealth that seemed almost fantastical to someone who had spent the last year of the war watching her country literally fall apart from lack of resources. One of the soldiers, a young private with red hair and freckles, noticed her staring and gave her a friendly wave. She froze, unsure how to respond. In her world, men did not wave casually at young women they did not know. There were protocols, formalities, proper channels. But this American just grinned and went back to unloading crates marked with red crosses. Medical supplies. Obasan Fumiko, Emiko's grandmother, had finally emerged from their shelter. She was 68 and had lived through the Meiji Restoration, the Russo-Japanese War, the Great Earthquake, and now this. She had seen Japan transform from a feudal society to a modern empire, and now to a defeated nation occupied by foreigners. She walked with a cane, her back bent, her face a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp as she surveyed the American soldiers. She moved to stand beside Haruko and spoke in a low voice. "They do not look like the pictures." "No," Haruko agreed. "They do not. They look healthy." "Yes. Our men look like ghosts next to them." It was true. As more Japanese men gathered, the contrast became starker. The average Japanese soldier who had survived the war was malnourished, exhausted, often suffering from untreated wounds or tropical diseases contracted in the Pacific campaigns. They averaged perhaps 5'4", 5'5" in height, and weighed between 100 and 120 pounds. The Americans averaged 5'10" or more, and weighed between 160 and 200 pounds. It was not just a difference, it was a chasm. Hiroshi had moved closer to his sister, his face unreadable. Haruko could feel the shame radiating off him, though he said nothing. What was there to say? He had given everything for the emperor, had fought with courage and discipline, had survived battles that killed most of his unit, and his reward was to come home defeated, starving, and confronted with the undeniable physical superiority of the enemy he had been told was soft and weak. Sergeant Morrison approached them, Corporal Suzuki translating. "We're setting up a mess hall to serve hot meals starting tomorrow. Everyone is welcome. You don't need papers or registration. Just come and eat." We have enough for everyone. Enough for everyone. Those words would have seemed like an impossible fantasy a week ago. What do you want in return? Hiroshi asked, his voice hoarse from disuse and suspicion. Morrison looked genuinely confused by the question. Want? Nothing. You're hungry. We have food. That's all there is to it. The simplicity of the statement was almost incomprehensible. In Japan, every transaction had layers of obligation and debt. On was the burden of owing. Giri was the duty to repay. Nothing came without strings. But this American seemed to be saying that food would be given simply because it was needed, with no expectation of return. Your government told you we were demons, Morrison continued. I get that. War propaganda. But we're just regular guys. We want to go home eventually. In the meantime, we're here to help Japan get back on its feet. That's our job. Haruko studied his face as Suzuki translated. Morrison had a scar on his left cheek, faded but visible. He had clearly seen combat. He had probably killed Japanese soldiers. Yet there was no hatred in his expression, no desire for revenge, just a kind of weary professionalism and something that might have been compassion. Do you hate us? The question came from Emiko, bold as always. Morrison considered it. Some of my buddies died fighting your army, but you're not your army. You're just people who got caught up in something bigger than any of us. So no, kid, I don't hate you. Over the next several hours, the Americans set up what they called a forward operating base. It was efficient, organized, and fast. They had portable generators for electricity. They had tents that went up in minutes. They had a field kitchen that was already preparing food, and the smell of cooking meat drifted across the ruins like a dream. Haruko could not remember the last time she had smelled meat cooking. More civilians were gathering, drawn by the smell and the cautious report spreading through the neighborhood that the Americans were not, in fact, killing everyone. There was still fear, still suspicion, but it was giving way to desperate hope and undeniable hunger. Michiko Sato arrived with her 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 4. She was 40 but looked 60, a widow who had been surviving by doing laundry for other families in exchange for rice. Her children were skeletal, their bellies distended from malnutrition, their hair thin and brittle. When she saw the Americans, she hesitated, pulling her children close. But then the 4-year-old, a little girl named Akiko, saw the soldier handing out chocolate and broke free, running forward with the fearless instinct of a hungry child. Michiko cried out, certain her daughter was running toward danger. But Private Jackson, the red-haired soldier, simply knelt down and handed the little girl a chocolate bar and a gentle pat on the head. Akiko stared at the chocolate like it was a holy relic, then ran back to her mother, clutching her prize. Michiko met Haruko's eyes across the crowd, and the 2 women shared a moment of silent communication. This changes everything. Lieutenant Anderson had commandeered a relatively intact building to use as a headquarters, and he invited the local officials to a meeting. The Japanese officials came with their heads bowed, expecting the worst. They had heard stories from other occupied territories about what conquering armies did. They expected demands, requisitions, humiliation. What they got instead was a practical discussion about sewage, clean water, and preventing cholera outbreaks. Anderson wanted to know what the community needed most urgently. He took notes. He listened. It was disorienting. Corporal Suzuki was kept busy translating, moving between groups, facilitating communication. He occupied a strange space, neither fully American nor fully Japanese in the eyes of either side. Some of the Japanese civilians looked at him with suspicion, seeing a traitor who had fought for the enemy. Others saw him as a bridge, someone who could help them navigate this new reality. Suzuki found Haruko organizing a list of civilians who needed medical attention. She had immediately fallen into the role of coordinator, using her nursing training and her natural competence. He noticed that she moved carefully, conserving energy, and that her hands shook slightly from weakness. When did you last have a full meal? He asked. She looked up, startled by the directness of the question. I don't remember. February, perhaps. Before the big raids. That was 7 months ago. Come with me. He led her to the field kitchen where an army cook, a heavy-set man with a thick Brooklyn accent, was preparing dinner for the troops. Suzuki spoke to him briefly, and the cook nodded, filling a metal tray with food. Beef stew, bread, canned peaches, coffee with real sugar. More food than Haruko had seen in one place in a year. I can't take this. This is for your soldiers. We have plenty. Eat. You'll be no good to anyone if you collapse from hunger. The logic was undeniable. Haruko took the tray with trembling hands and found a place to sit on a broken concrete block. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp, knowing that her shrunken stomach would rebel if she ate too fast. The flavors were overwhelming. Salt, fat, protein, sweetness. Her body responded with an almost painful intensity, awakening nerve endings that had been dormant for months. Emiko appeared at her side, eyes wide. Obasan says the Americans are giving out food tomorrow. Real food. Rice and vegetables and maybe even fish. If they're telling the truth, then yes. Why would they lie? What would be the point? It was a good question. There was no strategic advantage in promising food and then not delivering. It would only create resentment and resistance. If the Americans actually wanted to win the cooperation of the Japanese population, the most efficient way to do it was exactly what they appeared to be doing. Feed them. Show them kindness. Demonstrate that cooperation would be rewarded with basic human necessities. It was a simple strategy and probably devastatingly effective. Night fell, and the Americans set up floodlights powered by their generators. Artificial light, bright and steady, pushing back the darkness. Tokyo had been dark for years, blacked out against air raids. The sudden illumination felt almost blasphemous, like tempting fate. But the war was over. There were no more raids coming. The lights could stay on. Hiroshi sat apart from the others, smoking a cigarette that an American soldier had given him. American tobacco, smooth and mild compared to the harsh Japanese wartime cigarettes made from floor sweepings and hope. He watched the Americans moving around their camp with easy efficiency, laughing and joking with each other. They seemed so young, so carefree. Had they not just fought a war? Did they not understand the weight of what had happened here? But perhaps that was the point. America had won. They could afford to be carefree. They had not been bombed flat. Their cities still stood. Their families were intact. They had not lost everything. Sergeant Morrison sat down beside him without asking permission. Another American casualness that would have been rude in normal times but felt oddly comforting now. Morrison offered him another cigarette, which Hiroshi accepted. "You were a soldier," Morrison said through Suzuki's translation. It was not a question. Yes. Infantry. Pacific Theater. Tough fighting out there. Lost a lot of good men. Hiroshi nodded. So did we. They smoked in silence for a moment. Then Morrison said something that Suzuki hesitated before translating. "My brother died at Iwo Jima. He was 19. Hiroshi looked at him sharply. "And yet you're here giving us chocolate and cigarettes." Morrison shrugged. "War's over. You didn't kill my brother personally. I didn't kill your buddies personally. We were all just following orders. Now the orders are different. Now we're supposed to help rebuild. So that's what we do." The pragmatism was so American, so divorced from the complex web of honor and shame that governed Japanese thought. Morrison did not seem to carry any burden of the dead. He had simply moved on to the next task. Hiroshi envied him that freedom. "What will you do now?" Morrison asked. "Now that the war is finished." "I don't know. Before the war, I was a teacher. Mathematics. But the schools are destroyed. There are no jobs, no future. Give it time. Things'll get better. They always do." Hiroshi wanted to believe him. But sitting there in the ruins of Tokyo, malnourished and defeated, watching these healthy, confident Americans with their endless supplies and easy smiles, it was hard to see a path forward. The next morning, true to their word, the Americans set up a food distribution point. The line started forming before dawn. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, all hollow-eyed and desperate. Haruko helped organize them, creating some semblance of order, prioritizing families with small children and the elderly. The food came out in portions that seemed almost surreal in their abundance. Rice, canned vegetables, corned beef, powdered milk for children, even some fresh fruit that had been shipped in from who knows where. Each family received enough for several days. No papers were checked. No loyalty oaths were demanded. Just name, number of people in household, and here's your food. Michiko Sato stood in line with her 3 children, watching the smooth efficiency of the operation. American soldiers working alongside Japanese volunteers. Corporal Suzuki translating. Lieutenant Anderson supervising. Everything calm, orderly, respectful. When it was her turn, a young soldier with a kind face filled her basket carefully, making sure to include extra milk for the children. "Thank you," she said in halting English, one of perhaps 10 English words she knew. "You're welcome, ma'am," the soldier replied with a smile that reached his eyes. Ma'am. He had called her ma'am, a term of respect. She was the widow of a defeated enemy soldier, standing in line for charity food, and this young American had called her ma'am. Emiko was helping distribute the food alongside the Americans, her natural energy and fearlessness making her useful. She chattered away in Japanese, not caring that most of the soldiers could not understand her, relying on gestures and smiles. The Americans seemed charmed by her, this skinny teenager with bright eyes and irrepressible spirit. Private Jackson, the redhead, had taken to calling her Smiley, a nickname that stuck despite her not understanding the English word. Obasan Fumiko observed all of this with her sharp eyes, saying little but missing nothing. At one point she pulled Haruko aside and spoke quietly. "This is how they win. Not with guns, with food and kindness. They're smarter than we gave them credit for." "Is it winning if everyone benefits?" Haruko asked. The old woman smiled, a rare expression. "Perhaps that's the smartest victory of all, one where both sides end up better off." Over the following days and weeks, the pattern continued. The Americans set up medical clinics where Japanese doctors worked alongside army medics. They repaired water systems. They cleared rubble. They distributed supplies. And slowly, inevitably, the fear dissolved. The Japanese population began to adjust to the reality of occupation. Yes, these Americans were impossibly tall and healthy. Yes, they had won the war through overwhelming material superiority. Yes, seeing them walk down the street was a constant reminder of Japan's defeat. But they were not cruel. They did not rape or pillage. They followed rules. They respected boundaries. They were, in their own way, as disciplined as Japanese soldiers, just better fed and better equipped. The women of Japan, especially, began to notice things. The Americans treated women differently than Japanese men did. They held doors open. They said please and thank you. They made eye contact and smiled. They seemed to value women's opinions. It was strange, almost uncomfortable in its novelty, but not unpleasant. Haruko found herself working closely with the medical team, and particularly with Sergeant Morrison, who had taken an interest in public health initiatives. He treated her as a professional equal, asking her opinion on how to reach reluctant civilians, deferring to her knowledge of local customs. It was disorienting. Japanese military doctors had treated her as little more than a servant. This American soldier treated her like a colleague. One afternoon, while organizing vaccine distribution for children, Morrison asked her about her husband. Corporal Suzuki had told him that she was a widow. She answered matter-of-factly. "He died at Okinawa. He was a good man. The war took him." Morrison nodded. "I'm sorry. War takes a lot of good people. Did you ever marry?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He shook his head. "Got a girl back home. Susan. We've been writing letters. Gonna marry her when I get back to Iowa. Show her the ring I bought in Honolulu." He pulled out his wallet and showed her a photograph. A pretty blonde woman with a wide smile standing in front of a farmhouse. She looked healthy, happy, everything that Haruko was not. For just a moment, Haruko felt a sharp pang of envy. Not for Morrison, but for that woman in the photograph who had lived through the war without bombs falling on her home, without starvation, without losing everything. "She's beautiful," Haruko said, and meant it. The weeks turned into months. Autumn gave way to winter. The food distributions continued. The Americans brought in coal for heating. They set up schools and buildings that still had roofs. They showed movies in the evenings, American films that the Japanese population had been forbidden to watch for years. Charlie Chaplin, Mickey Mouse cartoons, and yes, Hollywood glamour films with impossibly beautiful actors and actresses. Emiko sat in the front row of the makeshift theater, watching in wonder as these impossibly attractive people lived impossibly perfect lives on screen. And then she looked at the American soldiers running the projector, and she realized they were not so different from the men on screen. Taller than Japanese men, healthier, with good teeth and confident postures. The movies had not been lying. Americans really did look like that. It explained so much. Why the soldiers carried themselves with such ease. They came from a country of abundance where everyone had enough to eat, where medicine was available, where life was simply easier. They were not superior as humans, but they had been given every advantage by an accident of geography and resources. Hiroshi had found work with the reconstruction effort, using his engineering knowledge to help plan the rebuilding of infrastructure. He worked alongside American engineers who shared their technical drawings freely, explained their methods patiently, treated him as a valuable contributor despite his country's defeat. It was slowly rebuilding his sense of purpose, giving him something to focus on beyond the shame of loss. One day, working on plans for a new water system, Hiroshi realized he was laughing at a joke one of the American engineers had made. Actually laughing. It felt like a betrayal at first, this casual camaraderie with the former enemy. But then he thought about what his alternative was: to nurse his resentment and his shame while his country rotted, or to accept help and work toward a future where perhaps Japanese children would grow up tall and healthy like these Americans. The choice, when framed that way, was obvious. Lieutenant Anderson was preparing to rotate back to the States, his tour complete. Before he left, he held a final meeting with the local officials and volunteers who had worked with him. He spoke through Suzuki's translation, his voice sincere. "When I came here, I expected hostility, maybe violence. We'd been told you would resist occupation with everything you had, but you've shown incredible resilience and grace. You've accepted help when it must have been humiliating to need it. You've worked alongside us despite the fact that we were enemies weeks ago. That takes courage, real courage. Not the kind you show in battle, but the kind you show in rebuilding. Thank you for teaching me that." The Japanese officials bowed deeply, moved by his words. When Anderson left the next morning, a small crowd gathered to see him off. Emiko was there, waving enthusiastically. Michiko Sato had brought her children, who held signs they had made thanking the Americans for the food. Hiroshi stood in the back, not waving, but present, acknowledging. Haruko stood beside Sergeant Morrison, who was staying for another few months. "You're all so young," she said quietly. "You look like movie stars, but you're just boys, aren't you? Boys who want to go home." Morrison nodded. "Yeah, that's exactly what we are. Just boys who want to go home. But in the meantime, we're trying to do some good. Leave things a little better than we found them. You have," she said. "You've helped us remember how to hope." As the truck carrying Lieutenant Anderson pulled away, Corporal Suzuki stood watching with complex emotions on his face. He was a bridge between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. But perhaps that was okay. Perhaps bridges were needed more than soldiers now. The story of Japan's occupation would go on for years with complexities and problems that would not be solved by chocolate bars and good intentions alone. But in those first crucial weeks and months, the fact that the Americans looked like movie stars instead of demons, that they brought food instead of vengeance, that they treated the defeated population with basic human decency, that made all the difference. It created space for cooperation, for healing, for the slow, difficult work of rebuilding not just buildings, but trust. Emiko would grow up in the new Japan, a Japan that would rise from the ashes to become an economic power. She would go to university, something her mother never dreamed possible. She would remember those first Americans, especially Private Jackson with his red hair and his chocolate bars, and she would think of them not as conquerors, but as the first hint that the world was larger and more hopeful than the war years had taught her. Hiroshi would help rebuild Japan's infrastructure, working on projects that would transform the nation. He would never fully escape the shadow of defeat, but he would channel his energy into construction rather than destruction. He would see his nieces and nephews grow up taller than he was, benefiting from better nutrition and peace. That would be enough. Haruko would eventually remarry to a Japanese doctor who had returned from the war in Manchuria. They would have children who would know the story of the Americans who came not as demons but as men, who showed that even enemies could choose kindness. She would tell them about Sergeant Morrison and his girl Susan in Iowa, and she would hope they had found their happiness. And Corporal Daniel Suzuki would return to California, carrying with him the weight of his dual identity, forever changed by his role as a bridge between the country of his birth and the country of his ancestors. He would spend his life trying to build more bridges, convinced that understanding between peoples was not just possible but necessary. The Americans never expected to be seen as movie stars. They were just soldiers doing a job, fed by a powerful economy, trained to rebuild as well as destroy. But to the women of Japan who had been promised demons and received men instead, men who smiled and shared their food and treated them with unexpected kindness, the contrast was transformative. It shattered propaganda. It opened possibilities. It reminded everyone involved that beneath uniforms and nationalities, there were just human beings trying to survive, and maybe, if they were lucky, find a little kindness along the way. If you found this story eye-opening, consider subscribing to our channel for more untold historical moments that challenge what you thought you knew about World War II. Drop a like if this changed your perspective, and leave a comment sharing what aspect of the post-war occupation surprised you most. History is full of these human moments that textbooks miss. Let's uncover them together.